June 6, 1944, 6:31 a.m. Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. 27 tanks are burning in the English Channel. Not damaged, not disabled. Burning, sinking, gone. The men inside them, welders from Ohio, farmers from Kansas, mechanics from Detroit, clawing at sealed hatches as freezing black water floods the compartments. 27 out of 32. In 11 minutes, before a single American boot touched French sand. And the man who ordered those tanks into water that every naval officer on his staff had warned him was too rough, that man was watching from a cruiser 3 miles offshore, sipping coffee, reading reports. His name was Omar Nelson Bradley. And in 6 hours, 2,500 Americans would be dead or wounded on a beach he had planned to capture in 40 minutes. But here is the part they never put in the history books. Here is the part that the medals and the monuments and the Hollywood films were specifically designed to make you forget. The soldiers on that beach, the ones dying in the surf, the ones pinned against the seawall with nowhere to go, they barely knew who Bradley was. They had never seen him. He had never visited their units. The general they called the GI general, the soldier's general, the humble man of the people, his own army's combat historian, would later describe his image as in one brutal word: rot. This is the story of the most successful public relations operation in American military history. This is the story of how a capable military bureaucrat became a living legend. And this is the story of what his own officers, the men who watched him make decisions from inside the headquarters, actually wrote down when they thought no one important was reading. By the time you finish this, you will understand why 33,000 Americans died in a forest with no strategic objective. You will understand why tens of thousands of German soldiers walked out of a trap that should have ended the war in France 4 months early. And you will understand why the man responsible for both disasters spent the rest of his life making sure his version of events was the only one most Americans ever heard. It begins not on a battlefield. It begins with a diary. October 1943. Allied Headquarters, North Africa. Chester Hansen was 26 years old. He had graduated from Syracuse University with a journalism degree, and he had been personally selected by Omar Bradley to serve as his aide-de-camp. His job was logistics scheduling correspondence, the administrative machinery that kept a general's headquarters functioning. But Hansen did something else, something that was by regulation strictly forbidden in the European theater. He kept a diary. Every night in a small notebook he carried in his breast pocket, Hansen wrote down everything: conversations, arguments, private assessments of generals who outranked him by 3 stars. He recorded what Bradley said at dinner. He recorded what Patton said when he thought the room was empty. He recorded the texture of command, the jealousies, the second-guessing, the moments of genuine courage, and the moments of catastrophic miscalculation. By the end of the war, that notebook would contain 250,000 words. Bradley knew Hansen was doing it. Bradley never told him to stop. That decision, that deliberate choice to allow a trained journalist to document everything, tells you something important about how Omar Bradley thought. He was not a man who left his legacy to chance, and the diary was only the beginning of the infrastructure. To understand what that infrastructure was built to protect you, have to understand the problem it was built to solve. And that problem had a name. That problem wore riding boots and carried an ivory-handled pistol and generated more headlines than any other general in the American Army. July 1943. Sicily. George Patton was everywhere. In the newspapers, on the radio, in the breathless dispatches of war correspondents, who had found exactly the kind of commander their readers wanted: flamboyant, aggressive, profane, unstoppable. Patton's 7th Army had raced across Sicily with a speed that shocked even the Germans. He was the story. He was the war. And then he slapped 2 soldiers in field hospitals who were being treated for combat exhaustion. He called them cowards. He threatened to shoot one of them. The story leaked. The headlines turned catastrophic. And Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, found himself with a problem that had no clean solution. He could not court-martial Patton. Patton was too valuable. But he could not let Patton keep dominating the public image of the American war effort either. The Army needed a different face. Someone the newspapers could print without generating congressional inquiries. Someone calm, presentable, polished enough to seem humble. Eisenhower looked at the officers around him, and he found his answer. He personally instructed war correspondent Ernie Pyle to, in Eisenhower's own framing, go and discover Bradley. Pyle spent 3 days with Bradley. 3 days. He produced a 6-part series that ran in over 400 daily newspapers across the United States. He called him the soldier's general. He wrote that Bradley was a quiet gentleman who might pass for a professor. He described Bradley's gentleness, his accessibility, his simple Missouri decency. Will Lang Jr. of Life magazine reinforced the image, writing that the thing he most admired about Bradley was that he never gave an order without saying, "Please," first. Here is what Pyle did not write. Because Pyle had spent 3 days at a headquarters, not 3 days with frontline infantry. He had interviewed Bradley and Bradley's staff. He had not interviewed the soldiers. The man who actually interviewed soldiers was Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall. Marshall was the Army's official combat historian. His entire job was to sit down with units immediately after battle and record exactly what had happened and what the men thought about their commanders. His access was total. His methodology was rigorous, and his verdict on the GI general image was delivered in language that left no room for interpretation. Marshall said the common soldier image was played up by Ernie Pyle. He said the GIs were not impressed with Bradley. He said they scarcely knew him. He said Bradley did not get out much to the troops. And he said the idea that Bradley was idolized by the average soldier was, and this is Marshall's word, rot. Not skepticism, not mild disagreement. Rot. This was not a rival general with an axe to grind. This was the professional historian the Army paid specifically to find out what soldiers thought. His conclusion was that the most famous soldiers general in American history was largely unknown to the soldiers he supposedly represented. But the myth was already built. And Omar Bradley understood better than almost anyone around him that in modern war, the narrative was as important as the territory. Chester Hansen's diary was the raw material. What came next was the construction. 1945, Washington, D.C. The war ended, and the apparatus did not stop. Hansen became Bradley's unofficial chief of public relations at the Veterans Administration. Then his chief letter and speechwriter when Bradley became Army Chief of Staff. Then his special assistant when Bradley became chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And then, most significantly, Hansen ghost-wrote Bradley's 1951 memoir, A Soldier's Story, using his wartime diary as the primary source. He received half the book's royalties. Rick Atkinson, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, called Hansen's diary surely among the most unusual documents ever written from within the headquarters of a major combat commander. He is right, but the problem historians have wrestled with ever since is structural. The most important primary source for understanding Bradley's headquarters was written by a man who was simultaneously Bradley's PR chief, his speechwriter, and his memoir's ghost author. The narrative filter was not applied to the archive. The narrative filter was the archive. A Soldier's Story was a massive commercial success. It shaped how an entire generation understood the campaign in Western Europe. It was measured, modest, and carefully crafted to position Bradley as the steady hand behind the Allied victory, the methodical professional who kept the machinery running while Patton chased headlines and Montgomery demanded glory. What the book did not contain was equally significant. It did not contain a serious accounting of Omaha Beach. It did not contain an honest examination of the Hürtgen Forest. It did not contain the intelligence warnings before the Battle of the Bulge. And it did not contain the private assessments of the officers who had watched Bradley make those decisions from inside the headquarters. Those assessments existed. They were being written down in real time in the same months and years that Hansen was constructing the official version. And they painted a picture so different from the GI general myth that reading them alongside a soldier's story feels like reading two accounts of completely different wars. The private record. George Patton kept an extensive wartime diary. His private assessments of Bradley were consistent from North Africa to Germany, and they were devastating in their specificity. He wrote that Bradley was a man of great mediocrity. He wrote that Bradley's qualifications as a general included wearing glasses, having a strong jaw, talking profoundly while saying little, and being a shooting companion of Army Chief of Staff George Marshall. He wrote that Bradley and his army commanders were such nothings that their great virtue was getting along by doing nothing. On operations, Patton was equally direct. He called Bradley too conservative. He wrote that Bradley wanted to wait until everyone could jump in together, by which time half the men would have the flu or trench foot. He called Bradley's breakout plan from Normandy Operation Cobra a very timid operation, though he acknowledged it was the best planned so far. And then Patton wrote something that cuts to the center of the entire relationship. He wrote that he did not wish any more of his ideas to be used without credit, which was what happened when he gave them orally to Bradley. That is not battlefield rivalry. That is a specific accusation of intellectual appropriation. Patton believed and documented the belief repeatedly that Bradley had taken several of his operational concepts during the Normandy campaign and presented them to Eisenhower as his own work. Martin Blumenson, the historian who edited the Patton papers, characterized the relationship between the two men as World War II's odd couple and documented that neither commander liked the other. The difference was that Patton wrote his assessments in a diary and Bradley had a professional journalist managing his. But the most revealing test of Bradley's command philosophy was not what he said about Patton. It was what he did to Terry Allen. August 1943. Sicily. Terry Allen commanded the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, the most experienced and most decorated American combat division in the Mediterranean theater. British General Sir Harold Alexander called Allen the best division leader he had seen in either World War. Bradley himself admitted in his own memoir that none had excelled the unpredictable Terry Allen in the leadership of troops. Bradley fired him anyway. He fired Allen and his assistant commander, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., and he did it in a way that his own memoir falsely described. Bradley wrote that the decision was his alone, that Patton merely concurred, that he personally called both men to his command post and delivered the news. Patton's diary from the same days tells a different story entirely, that Patton got Eisenhower's permission, that Patton telegraphed the relief to Bradley. The sequence of events directly contradicts Bradley's account. The official reason was discipline. The real reason was personal. Bradley was a teetotaler. He found Allen's reputation as a hard drinker repugnant. He found Allen's independent command style threatening. He wanted commanders who were, in his words, judicious, reasonable, and likable, meaning commanders who resembled Omar Bradley. Allen was devastated. The division artillery commander remembered it was painful to watch Terry break down. Allen later told an aide he had been shanghaied. Roosevelt wrote to Bradley begging for any assignment at all, writing that he would swim in with a 105mm howitzer strapped to his back. Eisenhower, when he learned the full circumstances, said it was a terrible injustice to General Allen to hint that he had been relieved for inefficiency. And then George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, the man at the very top, quietly overruled Bradley's judgment. He gave Allen command of the 104th Infantry Division. Allen trained them from scratch. He took them to combat in the Netherlands in October 1944. They fought for 195 days without a significant pause. They crossed the Ruhr, they crossed the Rhine. Their casualty rates were lower than comparable divisions, because Allen insisted on the aggressive patrolling and night tactics Bradley had found so difficult to manage. By the time Bradley visited Allen's division in Cologne, he had to admit that the 104th ranked alongside the 1st and the 9th as the finest assault divisions in the European theater. The man Bradley had fired for not fitting the mold had built a better division than anything Bradley directly commanded. That is the pattern. Not one incident, a pattern. The same logic that destroyed Terry Allen's career would send 33,000 Americans into the Hürtgen Forest. The same instinct that overruled his own officers' warnings at Omaha would dismiss the intelligence that predicted the Battle of the Bulge. The GI general was building his myth, and his army was about to pay the price. In Part 2, we go inside the decision that the U.S. Army's own official history called the most controversial tactical order of the entire Normandy campaign the moment Bradley stopped Patton at the Falaise Gap and watched two German armies walk out of a closing trap. The men who escaped that afternoon would come back in December. And when they did, they nearly broke the Allied line in half. In Part 1, we watched a reputation get built from scratch. Eisenhower personally directed a journalist to manufacture the GI general image. Chester Hansen recorded everything in a forbidden diary and later ghostwrote the memoir that sold that image to America. And when Bradley fired Terry Allen, the finest division commander in the theater, because Allen drank whiskey and ignored regulations, the pattern became impossible to miss. Bradley did not evaluate generals on whether they won battles. He evaluated them on whether they fit his idea of what a general should look like. But here is what Part 1 did not show you. It did not show you what happened when that pattern of thinking met a real operational opportunity. An opportunity so clear, so enormous, so obvious, that Patton was already moving to exploit it before Bradley even acknowledged it existed. It did not show you the Falaise Gap. August 1944, Normandy, France. Day 74 of the invasion. Operation Cobra had finally broken the German line. 6 weeks of grinding bloody stalemate in the Norman hedgerows, the bocage country where every field was a fortress, and every lane was a killing ground, and then Bradley's breakout plan had worked. Imperfectly, cautiously, but it had worked. The German line fractured. Patton's Third Army poured through the gap and swept south and east with a speed that caught even American planners off guard. By early August, the situation on the map looked like something that happened once in a generation. Maybe twice in a century. The German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army. The two formations that had been fighting the Allies to a standstill since June were inside a closing pocket. The Americans were pushing north from the south. The Canadians were pushing south from Falaise. Between them, near a town called Argentan, the gap was 20 miles wide and shrinking by the hour. Inside that pocket were somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 German soldiers. Their headquarters staffs, their experienced cadres, the institutional memory of two entire German armies. Patton's 15th Corps was already at Argentan. His lead elements were looking north at the Canadian advance. The distance separating the two Allied forces was 20 miles. Patton called Bradley. "We have elements in Argentan," Patton said. "Shall we continue and drive the British into the sea for another Dunkirk?" Bradley's response was immediate. "Seriously, George, stop where you are and build up on that shoulder. Stop. Do not advance. Hold the line and wait." Patton stopped. He wrote in his diary that night that it was a great mistake. He was not wrong. What happened over the next 48 hours is one of the most studied and debated decisions in the history of American military command. Bradley later explained his reasoning in terms of risk. He wrote that he was concerned Patton's forces could not hold a line across the gap against German breakout attempts. He wrote that the pocket might collapse inward and that American and Canadian units could end up firing at each other in the confusion. He wrote that it was better to let some Germans escape than to risk a catastrophic friendly fire incident. Those are reasonable concerns. Every experienced staff officer who has examined the decision has acknowledged them as real factors. The problem is what Bradley did next, because managing risk in a dynamic situation means adapting as conditions change. It means reassessing. It means asking whether the concerns that justified caution at noon are still valid at midnight when your forward units are reporting no significant German pressure on their northern flank. Bradley did not reassess. He doubled down. Over the following 2 days, he allowed Patton to redirect half of the 15th Corps eastward toward the Seine River, abandoning the northern push at precisely the moment when the gap was still closable and the Germans were still disorganized. This was not a decision forced on him by events. This was a deliberate reorientation of effort away from the encirclement and toward a different, shallower objective. The Germans saw the gap and they ran. Not in panic, not en route, but in organized columns moving at night, pushing through under artillery fire and air attack, taking casualties, but moving. The headquarters staff of the 7th Army got out. The headquarters staff of the 5th Panzer Army got out. Divisional commanders who had been fighting since Normandy got out with their maps, their communications equipment, their knowledge of Allied tactics and American command patterns. Estimates of how many soldiers escaped through the Falaise Gap range from 20,000 to over 100,000, depending on the historian and the methodology. The numbers inside the pocket when it finally closed on August 21st were devastating: over 10,000 German dead and 50,000 prisoners. But the pocket should have closed 2 weeks earlier, and it should have been twice as large. When Eisenhower toured the battlefield after the gap closed, he called the carnage unimaginable. Roads choked with destroyed vehicles and dead horses for miles in every direction. He stood in the middle of it and understood instinctively what it meant, that the men who should have been lying in those fields were already gone. French General Jacques Leclerc wrote to de Gaulle that the picture of the attack would have been superb had it been decided to close the pocket. The U.S. Army's own official history, published by the Center of Military History, described Bradley's halt order as the most controversial tactical decision of the entire Normandy campaign. Bradley's response to the criticism was consistent with every other failure in his career. He accepted no responsibility. In A Soldier's Story, he reframed the decision as prudent risk management. He emphasized the friendly fire concerns. He minimized the scale of the German escape. And he distributed blame toward Montgomery, whose Canadian forces had also moved slowly toward Falaise, carefully positioning the narrative so that the gap in the encirclement appeared to be a shared Allied failure rather than a specific American command decision. The men who escaped at Falaise did not disappear. They went east. They crossed the Seine. They reorganized in the forests and towns east of Paris. And through September and October and November, while Bradley was grinding divisions to pieces in the Hürtgen Forest with no coherent strategic objective, the Germans who had walked out through that 20-mile gap were being rearmed, reinforced, and prepared for something the Allied command did not believe was coming. December 1944. Bradley's headquarters, Luxembourg City. Brigadier General Kenneth Strong was the chief intelligence officer at SHAEF Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. His job was knowing what the Germans were doing before they did it. In early December, Strong personally traveled to Bradley's headquarters with a warning. German forces were massing in the Ardennes Forest east of the static 8th Corps positions. The buildup was significant. The indicators pointed toward a major offensive operation. Bradley dismissed it. His response, according to multiple accounts from officers present at the meeting, was 3 words: "Let them come." Colonel Oscar Koch Patton's own intelligence chief had been issuing similar warnings since late November. Patton recorded in his diary on November 25th that 1st Army was making a terrible mistake in leaving the 8th Corps in place along a static front, and that it was highly probable the Germans were massing against that exact position. Patton brought this assessment to Bradley directly. Bradley was not persuaded. On December 16, 1944, the German army launched Operation Watch on the Rhine. 200,000 German soldiers supported by 1,000 tanks hit the Ardennes front along a 75-mile line. The 8th Corps, 4 divisions, spread across terrain that would normally require 12, was overrun in hours. Bradley was in Versailles at Eisenhower's headquarters when the attack began. He dismissed the initial reports as localized activity, possibly a spoiling attack to disrupt Allied offensive preparations. It was Eisenhower who looked at the map and said with no hesitation, "That is no spoiling attack." It was Eisenhower who immediately ordered the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions to move toward Bastogne. Bradley's 12th Army Group then lost communications with 1st Army for more than 48 hours. His headquarters in Luxembourg City sat south of the German penetration, physically separated from two of the three armies he was supposed to command. He could not influence the battle. He could not redirect forces. He could not communicate with his own commanders. On December 20th, Eisenhower made the decision that Brady would never forgive. He transferred temporary command of 1st Army and 9th Army to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, whose 21st Army Group was positioned north of the German penetration and could actually communicate with those headquarters. The transfer was geometrically logical. Montgomery was in contact. Bradley was not. Bradley threatened to resign. He told Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Bedell Smith, that if that order stood, Bradley ought to be relieved. Patton, who had just been tasked with pivoting his entire 3rd Army 90 degrees north in one of the most remarkable staff operations of the war, told Bradley to go ahead and resign. He said the two of them would make a fine pair of privates. Historian Carlo D'Este, in his detailed assessment of the Bulge command crisis, wrote that Bradley's reaction was itself ample justification for Eisenhower's order. A theater commander cannot make operational decisions based on a subordinate's ego. The transfer was not a judgment on Bradley's competence. It was a practical response to geography. Bradley sat on the wrong side of a German breakthrough. But Bradley did not see it that way. He spent the critical days of the battle lobbying for the return of his armies, rather than concentrating on the operational problem unfolding 40 miles to his north. When Montgomery held a press conference in January that appeared to credit British forces with saving the American position, Bradley channeled his fury into a personal vendetta that consumed him for decades. In A General's Life, the memoir published 2 years after his death, Bradley admitted he had greatly underestimated the enemy's offensive capabilities. But biographer Stephen Osad documented that Bradley took no personal responsibility for the failure. He blamed Montgomery. He blamed Eisenhower. He blamed the intelligence system. He did not mention the German commanders who had escaped at Falaise 4 months earlier. He did not mention Kenneth Strong's warning. He did not mention the 3 words he had spoken when his own intelligence officers told him what was coming. The pattern that destroyed Terry Allen's career, that halted Patton at Argenton, that sent 33,000 men into the Hürtgen Forest, that same pattern had just handed the Germans their last major offensive success of the war in Western Europe, and Bradley was already writing his version of events. But here is what no one was watching while Bradley managed the narrative of the Bulge. Hidden inside the story of the Hürtgen Forest, the disaster Bradley barely mentioned in either memoir, were the specific decisions made at specific moments that 33,000 American families never stopped paying for. The forest that German generals said they could not understand why Americans kept attacking. The forest where Bradley later claimed there had been a strategic objective all along. In Part 3, Rick Atkinson's documented evidence that this claim was a fabrication, and the night Bradley's own war diary proved it. In Part 1, we watched Eisenhower personally engineer the GI General brand, and Bradley fire Terry Allen, the finest division commander in the theater, for not fitting the institutional mold. In Part 2, we watched Bradley halt Patton at the Falaise Gap and let 2 German armies walk out of a closing trap, then dismiss intelligence warnings until 200,000 German soldiers proved him catastrophically wrong in the Ardennes. The men who escaped at Falaise came back in December, and Bradley spent the Battle of the Bulge lobbying for his armies instead of fighting the battle. But here is the number that puts everything into context: 33,000. That is the American casualty count from a single sustained operation that Bradley barely mentioned in either memoir. An operation conducted in 50 square miles of dense forest, where every American advantage air power armor artillery mobility was completely negated. An operation the German enemy could not understand because the terrain denied the attackers every weapon they possessed. The Hürtgen Forest, September 1944 to February 1945. And the story of how Bradley described it afterward reveals more about his character than any single battlefield decision he ever made. The forest that made no sense. The Hürtgen sat on the German-Belgian border, 50 square miles of dense pine forest, threaded with narrow fire breaks, and floored with mud and mines. The trees grew close enough that a man could not see 10 yards to either side. Visibility overhead was zero. The canopy was so thick that aerial reconnaissance could not penetrate it, and the same canopy that blocked observation blocked air support entirely. American artillery, normally the decisive advantage on the Western Front, became counterproductive. Shells detonated in the treetops and showered the ground below with wooden splinters that tore through flesh as viciously as shrapnel. The Germans called them tree bursts. The American medics called them something worse. Tank treads could not grip the muddy fire breaks. Armor that could operate freely across the open fields of France was channeled into single-file columns that a handful of German engineers with mines could stop cold. The German defensive positions, concrete bunkers interlocking fields of fire minefields mapped with meticulous precision, had been designed specifically for this terrain and had been months in the preparation. The first American units entered the Hürtgen in mid-September 1944. The 9th Infantry Division attacked along a 2-mile front and spent 6 weeks gaining approximately 2 miles of forest. Their casualty count was 4,500 men. For 2 miles. Against prepared positions in terrain that eliminated every advantage the American military possessed in 1944. The information was clear. The lesson was unambiguous, and Bradley kept attacking. Division after division was fed into the forest through the fall and into winter. The 28th Infantry Division, under Major General Norman Coda, received orders requiring 3 regiments to advance simultaneously toward 3 separate objectives along a 15-mile front with no adjacent units providing flank support. Coda was by the documented record perplexed and deeply unhappy. He found the orders too prescriptive, too detailed, leaving nothing for his own judgment or his staff's initiative, just blind execution of a plan drawn up by men who were not in the trees. Coda's objections were given little weight. The 28th Division suffered 6,184 casualties in approximately 1 week of combat. The 112th Infantry Regiment alone lost 2,316 men out of 3,100 committed. When Eisenhower and Bradley visited Coda's headquarters afterward, Eisenhower looked at the maps and said, "Well, Dutch, it looks like you got a bloody nose." The division commander, who had walked upright through machine gun fire on Omaha Beach, who had personally rallied men off the seawall when the landing was collapsing, who had executed the plan his superiors handed him, that man nearly lost his command for executing that plan. Hodges recommended Coda's relief. Bradley, the same Bradley who kept Courtney Hodges in command through the entire Hürtgen disaster, because Hodges was quiet and compliant and fit the mold that Bradley nearly fired Coda for following orders. Major General Rudolf Gersdorf, Chief of Staff of the German 7th Army, later wrote that the German command could not understand the reason for the strong American attacks in the Hürtgen Forest. The fighting denied the Americans every advantage their air and armored forces offered. He was not being modest. He was genuinely baffled. The enemy could not understand the strategy. The division commanders executing the strategy objected to it in real time. The terrain made the objectives almost impossible to achieve, and Bradley kept attacking. The fabrication. After the war, Bradley needed an explanation. 33,000 casualties demanded justification, and in his memoirs, Bradley provided one. He wrote that by mid-October 1944, his headquarters was very much aware of the threat posed by the Roer River Dam's massive concrete structures upstream that the Germans could use to flood the entire valley and trap any Allied forces that had crossed the river. He wrote that the whole point of the Hürtgen attack was to gain control of those dams. He positioned the operation not as a grinding, purposeless attrition fight, but as a coherent strategic effort to neutralize a specific German capability. Rick Atkinson, working from primary documents for his Liberation trilogy, examined this claim directly. His verdict was delivered in 2 words not true. The documentary record shows that Bradley's own First Army did not order planning for seizing the dam sites until November 7, 1944, nearly 2 months into the Hürtgen operation. Bradley's own war diary did not note the decision that the dams must be controlled until December 4, 1944. By that date, the 9th Division, the 28th Division, and the 4th Infantry Division had already suffered the majority of their catastrophic losses. The dams were not the original objective. The original rationale for attacking through the Hürtgen was to clear the forest as a perceived threat to the Allied flank, a vague tactical concern that no one at the time translated into a coherent operational plan with defined success criteria. The operation that consumed 33,000 Americans began without a strategic objective worthy of the cost, continued without one, and acquired a retroactive justification only after the memoirs were being written. Atkinson stated this flatly. Bradley was a contributor to mythology about his role and his level of competence. The Hürtgen was the clearest evidence. November 16, 1944. The 4th Infantry Division enters the Hürtgen. The 4th had landed at Omaha Beach on D-Day. It had fought across France and into Germany. By mid-November, it was considered one of the most experienced divisions in the European theater. It entered the Hürtgen on November 16th with its combat veterans, its institutional knowledge, its hardened non-commissioned officers who had been in the field since June. In 3 weeks, the 4th Infantry Division suffered over 7,000 total casualties. More than 2,000 of those were not from German bullets or German shells. They were from trench foot and combat exhaustion, the slow grinding destruction of men kept in frozen mud, without adequate rotation, without dry boots, without relief, fed into an operation that had no visible endpoint and no apparent purpose that the men in the trees could identify. Ernest Hemingway, who was present as a war correspondent during part of the Hürtgen fighting, described it as Passchendaele with tree bursts. He was not exaggerating. The comparison to the worst sustained attrition battle of the First World War was not rhetorical. It was operational. Gerald Astor, in his detailed account, The Bloody Forest, wrote that the almost universal condemnation of their superiors by individuals who fought in the Hürtgen offers a cautionary note on the reliability of histories drawn from official documents and the personal papers of men like Eisenhower and Bradley. The men in the trees knew what the men at the headquarters did not acknowledge. They were being fed into a machine that produced casualties without producing victory. The 4th Division's after-action reports, the 28th Division's operational logs, the medical records from field hospitals in the rear. These documents tell a story so different from a soldier's story that they might as well describe a different command. And Bradley barely mentioned the Hürtgen at all. That silence is its own verdict. 2 memoirs, hundreds of pages of self-justification, score-settling, and narrative management. And the operation that produced the costliest sustained American engagement on the Western Front received the equivalent of a paragraph and a footnote. The system that built him. Here is the larger pattern that the Hürtgen makes visible. The American Army in World War II had a structural tendency to reward managers and punish gamblers. It rewarded officers who fit the institutional model, quiet, differential, politically aware, skilled at managing upward. It punished officers who were effective in combat, but culturally incompatible with the command hierarchy. Bradley was not the cause of that system. He was its most successful product. And by controlling the narrative for decades after the war, through Hansen's diary, through 2 memoirs, through a Hollywood film shaped around his version of events, he ensured that the system's values were treated as objective history. Terry Allen, who Bradley fired for drinking and independent thinking, built a better division than anything Bradley directly commanded. Norman Cota, who nearly lost his career for following Bradley's own orders, had been one of the genuine heroes of D-Day. The 33,000 men lost in the Hürtgen paid the price for an operation without a coherent objective, conducted by a command structure that valued compliance over competence at every level. The German enemy was baffled. The division commanders were objecting in real time, and the memoir written afterward claimed it had all made sense from the beginning. But here is what the memoirs could not control. The private diaries, the letters, the after-action reports buried in the National Archives. The professional historians who spent decades after Bradley's death working through the documentary record, without the filter of Chester Hansen's carefully managed narrative. Those historians found something Bradley spent 40 years trying to prevent anyone from finding. In Part 4, we look at what happened when the myth finally met the evidence. The historians who dismantled it piece by piece. The specific documents that proved the fabrications. And the question that the entire story forces you to ask not just about Omar Bradley, but about every institution that values the appearance of competence over the reality of it. The GI General built his legacy in ink. The men who died in the Hürtgen Forest are still there. In parts 1 through 3, we watched the complete architecture of a military myth. Eisenhower manufactured the GI General brand on instructions. Chester Hansen recorded everything in a forbidden diary, and Ghost wrote the memoir that sold that brand to America. Bradley halted Patton at the Falaise Gap and let 2 German armies walk free. He dismissed intelligence warnings until 200,000 Germans proved him wrong in the Ardennes. And in the Hürtgen Forest, he sent 33,000 Americans into 50 square miles of trees with no coherent strategic objective, then spent decades claiming there had been one all along. But here is the question. Parts 1 through 3 did not answer. What happened when the myth finally met the evidence? What happens to a carefully constructed narrative when the historians arrive with the documents? Because here is the twist that Bradley did not plan for. He spent 40 years controlling the story. And the story outlasted him anyway, what Bradley left behind. Omar Bradley died on April 8, 1981 in New York City. He was 88 years old. He had outlived Patton by 35 years, outlived Eisenhower by 12, outlived most of the men who had watched him make decisions from inside the headquarters. He died a 5-star general, the last 5-star general in American history, a title Congress had created specifically for him in 1950. He died honored, he died celebrated, and he died having spent the final decade of his life still managing the narrative, still shaping how the war would be remembered, still ensuring that his version of events was the version most Americans encountered. Kitty Bradley. His second wife had engineered his role as technical advisor on the 1970 film Patton. That film, starring George C. Scott, winning 7 Academy Awards, seen by tens of millions of Americans, was built partly on Bradley's memoir and made without Patton's family's cooperation. It gave Bradley the most powerful tool in his arsenal control over the definitive cinematic version of his greatest rival. For a generation of Americans, their entire understanding of Patton came filtered through a film that Bradley had helped shape. S.L.A. Marshall, the combat historian who had called the GI General image rot, reviewed the film and said that Bradley's name got heavy billing on a picture that showed a victorious glory-seeking buffoon. The film's Patton was brilliant, but uncontrollable, a liability saved by steadier hands. Those steadier hands in the film's framing belonged to Omar Bradley. Marshall knew what he was watching. Most of the audience did not. Chester Hansen died in 2003. He had spent 60 years as Bradley's most effective instrument, from the forbidden diary in North Africa to the ghost-written memoir to the decades of speechwriting and correspondence management. He received half the royalties from a soldier's story. He gave interviews in his later years that were careful, measured, and consistently supportive of the Bradley legacy he had spent his adult life constructing. He never broke ranks. Whatever he actually thought about the decisions he had documented in 250,000 words, the Falaise halt, the Hürtgen, the bulge, he kept those assessments private. The diary itself, that extraordinary document, eventually found its way into the archives where Rick Atkinson and other historians could examine it properly. And what they found there was not the GI General of the pile dispatches. It was something more complicated and more human, a commander who made real decisions with real consequences, surrounded by men who knew the difference between what was happening and what was being written down for posterity. The historians arrive. The serious revision of Bradley's reputation did not happen overnight. It happened in layers across decades as the primary documents became available, and scholars who had no institutional stake in the myth began working through the record. Carlo d'Este was among the first to articulate the gap systematically. His work on the Normandy campaign documented the Falaise decision with a precision that Bradley's memoirs had deliberately obscured. D'Este called the Hürtgen Forest fighting the most ineptly fought series of battles of the war in the West. He was not sensationalizing. He was summarizing what the operational records showed. Rick Atkinson's Liberation trilogy, completed in 2013, became the definitive modern account of the American campaign in Western Europe. Atkinson worked from primary documents, diaries, after-action reports, signal logs, the actual war diaries that Bradley's memoirs had summarized or ignored. His verdict on Bradley was measured but clear. Bradley had been a contributor by virtue of 2 memoirs to the mythology about his role and his level of competence. The Hürtgen Forest justification was documented as retroactive fabrication. The claim that seizing the Roer dams had been the objective all along was contradicted by Bradley's own war diary, which did not note the dam decision until December 4, 1944, months after the killing had begun. Stephen Ossad's biography, published in 2017 and awarded the Society for Military History Distinguished Book Award in 2018, organized its entire analysis around a single consistent behavioral pattern: Bradley's inability to accept responsibility for mistakes. Ossad found the pattern embedded in Bradley's earliest documented behavior. At West Point, the young Bradley had been picked off first base during a baseball game and spent years afterward distributing blame to the coach, to the first baseman, to the signals. Ossad argued this small moment anticipated an entire career of deflecting accountability. The Hürtgen was someone else's fault. The bulge was Montgomery's fault. Falaise was Patton's problem. The Allen firing was Eisenhower's idea, except when it was Bradley's idea, depending on which version served the moment. Conrad Crane, the Chief of Historical Services at the Army Heritage and Education Center, an institution whose entire purpose is preserving and transmitting military history, accurately named Bradley directly as World War II's most overrated leader. He said Bradley's image was a creation of Ernie Pyle, and that his reputation was probably better than he deserved. This was not a contrarian academic looking for attention. This was the senior historian of the institution responsible for maintaining the Army's own record. Thomas Ricks in The Generals highlighted the central irony that Bradley's relief decisions, the firings that were supposed to demonstrate accountability and maintain standards, were driven by personal compatibility rather than performance. He kept officers who fit the mold regardless of results. He removed officers who did not fit the mold regardless of results. Terry Allen, who Bradley fired, trained the 104th Infantry Division from scratch and produced one of the finest assault formations in the European theater. Courtney Hodges, who Bradley protected, presided over the Hürtgen Forest disaster and was so mentally exhausted by late 1944 that Montgomery asked Eisenhower for permission to relieve him. The standard Bradley applied had nothing to do with winning battles. It had everything to do with resembling Omar Bradley. What the record actually shows. Here is the final accounting. Not the myth. The record. Bradley fired the finest division commander in the Mediterranean theater because the man drank and defied regulations. The division commander he fired went on to build a better division than anything Bradley directly commanded. Bradley halted the closing encirclement at Falaise and let somewhere between 20,000 and 100,000 German soldiers escape, including the headquarters staffs of 2 entire armies. Those staffs rebuilt and returned in December. Bradley dismissed 2 separate intelligence warnings before the Ardennes offensive, lost communication with 2 of his 3 armies for 48 hours, and spent the critical days of the battle lobbying for command restoration instead of fighting the battle. He sent 33,000 Americans into the Hürtgen Forest without a coherent strategic objective, and then spent 40 years claiming there had been one. And through all of it, he maintained the image. The humble man from Missouri, the wire-rimmed glasses, the simple uniform, the general who said please before giving orders. Jonathan Jordan's 2011 book, Brothers, Rivals, Victors, drawing on private correspondence, documented one detail that functions as a perfect ending to the entire story. Bradley refused to vote for Eisenhower in both the 1952 and 1956 presidential elections. The loyal subordinate, the man Eisenhower had personally built up as the embodiment of selfless American service. The general who owed his entire public reputation to Eisenhower's 1943 instruction to go and discover Bradley. That man spent the post-war years convinced that Eisenhower had made wartime decisions for his own political benefit. The man Eisenhower had made was spending his later years convinced that Eisenhower had been the selfish one all along. Why this story matters. You have been watching this for 90 minutes. That investment deserves a direct answer to the only question that actually matters. Why does this story deserve to be told? Not because Bradley was uniquely villainous. He was not. He was courteous. He did not slap soldiers in field hospitals. He did not chase headlines or generate political scandals. By the standards of personal conduct, he was exactly what the Pile dispatches described: a decent, quiet, professionally competent man. The story deserves to be told because the machinery that built the GI General myth is still operating. It operates in every institution that values the management of appearance over the reality of performance. It operates every time a system promotes the person who manages upward skillfully over the person who produces results without managing perceptions. It operated in 1944 when Bradley kept Hodges and fired Allen, and it operates today in every organization where the person who fits the mold advances and the person who produces results without fitting it gets sidelined. The cost in 1944 was not measured in quarterly reports. It was measured in 33,000 men in the Hürtgen Forest, in the German soldiers who walked out of the Falaise Gap and came back in December, in the 2,500 Americans who died at Omaha Beach on a plane that Bradley's own subordinate officers had warned against in specific detail. The men who served under Bradley, the ones who wrote honestly in their diaries and their letters, knew the difference between the myth and the man. Patton called him a man of great mediocrity. Marshall called the idea that soldiers idolized him rot. Allen called himself shanghaied. Coda was nearly relieved for executing Bradley's own orders. The German enemy could not understand why Bradley kept attacking where the terrain eliminated every American advantage. History belongs to those who write it down first. Omar Bradley understood that earlier and more completely than almost anyone around him. He had a journalist aide, a ghost-written memoir, a Hollywood film, and 40 years of active narrative management. He had Chester Hansen's 250,000 words. What he did not have, and what he could not prevent, was the documents. The war diaries that recorded December 4th, not mid-October. The operational logs that showed what the 9th Division lost for 2 miles of Hürtgen Forest. The patent papers that recorded what was actually said and who actually made which decisions. Those documents waited in the archives with infinite patience. They did not need to manage their reputation. They just needed historians willing to read them. The GI General was not a lie in the simple sense, but the myth built around a modest man's modest virtues served purposes that had nothing to do with truth and cost more than any honest accounting of them was ever allowed to show. If you know a story like this one, an institutional myth that the documents tell differently, leave it in the comments. These are the histories that matter most, not the ones on the monuments, the ones in the archives that nobody built a monument to. The real war is always in the paperwork,